First tonight, amid increasing international pressure on Israel over the war in Gaza, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has condemned the decision by Britain, Norway, Australia, Canada and New Zealand to sanction two far-right Israeli ministers. Mr. Rubio said the sanctions don't advance US-led efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, bring all hostages home or end the war. Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich may face an immediate asset freeze and travel ban over accusations of inciting extremist settler violence and serious abuses of Palestinian rights in the occupied West Bank. Meanwhile, dozens more Palestinians have been killed as they tried to access aid in Gaza. In three separate incidents, 31 people died near an aid convoy transporting flour to a US and Israeli-backed food distribution center. The Hamas authorities said Israeli forces opened fire on crowds. Israel has not commented. Reports say at least 160 people have been killed since this new mechanism for distributing aid was introduced 2 weeks ago. Well, for more on these stories, I'm joined now on the line from here in Abuja by the Israeli ambassador to Nigeria, Michael Freeman. Mr. Freeman, thank you very much indeed for joining us. How significant and radical do you think it is that the UK, Canada, Australia, Norway and New Zealand have decided to impose sanctions on two serving Israeli ministers?
Good evening, Charles. Thank you for having me. Look, I think this is disappointing. I think it is disproportionate. I think it is wrong. Ultimately here, we've seen a number of countries take the decision to put sanctions on an ally of members of a government who is an ally who work together with the clear aim of trying to end a war which Israel is fighting, which is fighting in self-defense in order to return our hostages. It's self-defeating, and I don't think it's going to make any difference whatsoever. It's only going to alienate and push people further away.
But I mean, how concerned are you that we've seen the overall view of the UK House of Commons, a house you're well familiar with, across parties, change in the last few weeks in the face of what many MPs say is the ongoing horrors in both the occupied West Bank and Gaza?
I think that the analysis is completely wrong, and it doesn't help in any way whatsoever. What will help is for the pressure to increase on Hamas in order to release the hostages. Ultimately, if Hamas release the 55 hostages, if Hamas lay down their arms, this war is over. And that's what the pressure needs to be, and that's where the pressure needs to come. We've seen that the US has condemned this action, and we've seen also the real blatant hypocrisy. One of the countries that put these sanctions, Norway, today welcomed the Iranian foreign minister. This is the man who openly threats to annihilate and destroy the state of Israel, is the backer of Hamas, the backer of the Houthis, the backer of Hezbollah, the backer of all of the instability and terror organization. And he is welcomed with open arms in one of these countries, and they're putting sanctions on Israeli ministers. The hypocrisy is just spellbinding, and it's something that we really need to understand here, that this is not based on trying to make a difference, to stop people from using language that they find insensitive or they find insulting or they find inappropriate. Because if so, the Iranian foreign minister will be top of that list. So clearly there's an ulterior motive and a different agenda that's going on here. And that agenda is trying to stop a war which Israel is fighting to release the hostages. And if that's the agenda, then the best way of achieving that is to put more pressure on Hamas and to encourage them to release immediately the 55 hostages, living and dead, that they're holding, and to lay down their arms.
Well, to be fair, Ambassador, I mean, there are sanctions on Western sanctions on Iran at the moment, which have crippled that country's economy. But British MPs across party lines say they want to see a ceasefire in Gaza, and they want an unconditional release of all the hostages and aid going in. But they say that that doesn't make right the kind of extremist language and incitements to violence they've seen from these two particular ministers, who they say stand out for the extremism they've been promoting.
Well, if they were really interested in making this war end, then the pressure needs to increase on Qatar, the pressure needs to increase on Hamas in order to release those hostages. And that's what we need to see. You know, we saw only this week, we've seen Mohammed Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, in the last couple of days state that he thinks that there were some great achievements from October the 7th. Where are the sanctions on Mahmoud Abbas? Where are the sanctions on many of the other Palestinian leaders that are making much more outrageous statements and much more violent statements? So if you're going to put sanctions and you're going to say the reason for doing that is because the statements are encouraging violence, then surely there's a whole list of other people you need to be putting sanctions on. And when you're not, it's quite clear that the reason you're not doing that is not because of statements, but it's because of your wish to influence policy. It's your wish of your desire to try and stop a war that Israel is fighting in order to release our hostages, in order for us to get Hamas to lay down their arms and to ensure that October the 7th never happens again.
Ambassador, you're talking about groups that you yourself refer to as terrorist organizations. We're talking about a democracy, Israel, and talking about ministers that represent Israel who are inciting people to violence in the West Bank, which have led to attacks on Palestinians, and they've promoted the policy of extending the illegal settlements announced recently. We've seen very strong language about expelling Palestinians in Gaza, which is adding to the sense of violence and horror there. And they've supported the militarization of starvation. And these are ministers who represent a democracy, the Israeli government. So MPs say the decision to impose sanctions is a logical, needed next step to maximize pressure, working with international partners.
Well, the thing is, though, that I think these MPs are completely wrong, and I'll explain why. These MPs are at the same time calling for the recognition of a Palestinian state led by Mahmoud Abbas, who this week, as I said that there were great achievements from October the 7th. Now, if you're going to be calling for recognizing a Palestinian state, and you're going to be pressuring and rewarding what happened on October the 7th and rewarding terrorism, then we need to understand these decisions in that context. They cannot say on the one side of things, we want to try and stop this violence, or the language of violence, and therefore we're going to put sanctions on these two ministers, but at the same time say, well, next week we're going to consider recognizing an independent Palestinian state led by people who are making far worse calls for violence and are praising actual violence. So the hypocrisy is really quite astounding there, and it's not something that's acceptable, and you can see through quite what the motivation is for these things. But I would also emphasize, and it's important to emphasize, that these two ministers are not the ministers that are setting policy. The Prime Minister is setting policy. Israel's policy is very clear. We do not have territorial desires over Gaza. We do not have long-term territorial desires to be there. Israel left the Gaza Strip in 2005, withdrew all of our soldiers, all of our settlers, and we gave the Palestinians an opportunity to establish a form of statehood, to establish a form of independence. And instead of taking that opportunity, they turned it into a terror state and a terror base in order which to attack us.
Well, I mean, I know you touched on this briefly earlier, Ambassador, but I wonder what your reaction is to the news that there is a conference next week at which further UK action is being proposed on the unconditional recognition of Palestine in order to force through the two-state solution.
Well, such a recognition would do the exact opposite rather than recognizing a two-state solution. It's a completely ridiculous decision, or would be a ridiculous decision. There is no Palestinian state. There is no ability, even by their own standards, the so-called Palestinian state, the Palestinian Authority, can't even control the West Bank. It doesn't have enough power to impose security on the West Bank. It certainly couldn't run the Gaza Strip. It cannot run its own medical systems. It cannot run all of those systems within there. It's clearly not a state. It clearly doesn't have the institutions of state. It doesn't have the ability to act as a state. It certainly couldn't come into Gaza, rebuild, rerun Gaza, and stop the violence that's taking place there and release the hostages. This is being led by a man in Mahmoud Abbas who still hasn't condemned October the 7th and the violence that was carried out, the terrorism, the violence, the rape, the murder. This is an organization that he heads of Fatah, who have been involved in terrorism for years upon years and have murdered countless Israelis. To give somebody like that a state and to recognize a state would only drive a two-state solution further away. And the reason for that is because there would be the Palestinians would see no need to compromise. They would see no need to enter into negotiations. Why do I need to enter in negotiations with Israel if the rest of the world will give me what I want without me having to make compromises, without me having to do what I need? And therefore, it's a very, very dangerous step. And at this moment, when there's concrete progress being made on a ceasefire in Gaza, and I can tell you there is significant progress that's been made over the last couple of days, such a decision will, in all likelihood, break down those discussions. They would push away the possibility of a ceasefire because the Palestinians and Hamas would say, well, we don't need to make compromise. If we just carry on doing what we're doing, the rest of the world will give us what we want without us having to do anything.
Well, Ambassador, you made the point that those Palestinian territories don't have institutions, and the argument is made that the reason they don't have those institutions, the reasons they're as weak as they are, is that Israel has deliberately weakened them. The argument is that two wrongs don't make a right. The disproportionate response of the Israeli government attacking innocent Palestinians, destroying, I'm not talking about the attack against Hamas, I'm talking about the civilians who are getting killed, destroying infrastructure and bringing about a terrible level of starvation and humanitarian crisis that we've seen for a long time is quite simply intolerable. I mean, surely you can see that.
Well, I take dispute with almost everything that you said there, Charles. We know each other very well. We've spoken many times. But in that last sentence, I really do dispute many of the things. I don't believe that we're not targeting civilians. Absolutely, civilians are being caught up in this war. Civilians get caught up in every war, and it's a tragedy. And my heart genuinely goes out to all of those innocents who are caught up in this war, whether that be Israelis or Palestinians. And the way this needs to end is by Hamas laying down its arm and releasing the hostages. But we are doing what we can to avoid civilian casualties. The Hamas, on the other hand, are working to increase. We saw only this week clear evidence where Mahmoud Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was killed whilst he was hiding in his bunker underneath a hospital in Gaza. We see Hamas using the hospitals, the schools, the civilian infrastructure as their human shield. And regarding starvation, again, we don't accept their starvation. We believe that there is the need to bring in food. Over the last few days, 1,400 trucks have gone into Gaza. 500 of them are waiting on the Gaza side for it to be distributed. And in addition to that, the GHF, the new foundation that's been set up to distribute food, has distributed over 10 million meals in the last number of days. So food is being distributed. It is getting out to the people that need it, but it's getting out to people without it going through Hamas's hands. And so Hamas are doing everything they can to stop that distribution of aid, including threatening people who are handing out the aid, threatening those people who are going to collect the aid, because Hamas understand that as soon as the Palestinian population in Gaza can get food and can get aid directly without having to go through Hamas, then Hamas's days are numbered within Gaza.
Well, finally, Ambassador, I mean, what impact do you think this decision by the UK government to impose sanctions on these two Israeli ministers is going to have on the UK's relations with Israel, for example, which up till now has remained one of its biggest allies, because, I mean, the single cross-party message from the UK House of Commons is that this decision is right and that more needs to be done.
Well, there are significant voices within the UK saying they don't agree with this decision. But it's not only UK, as you said, it's other countries as well. The government will be having a meeting early next week, a cabinet conversation about how to respond to this. But I think that it's the wrong decision. I think that it is a disappointing decision. And more importantly, I think it drives the prospects of peace further away, and it drives the prospects of a ceasefire in Gaza further away. And so I think that the intentions of these people who have imposed are going to backfire. And they are going to encourage those people who reject any form of compromise on the Palestinian side. They are going to encourage Hamas, and the hypocrisy of not putting sanctions on other people and other countries who are coming out with far greater statements is really quite astounding. So I'm disappointed. I'm upset, and I think that it pushes peace further away.
I want to thank you very much indeed, Mr. Freeman, for taking the time to talk to us. I know you've got a busy day, so we really appreciate it. Michael Freeman is the Israeli ambassador to Nigeria.